All right, welcome everybody to the Vermont Ag Water Quality Partnership Lunch and Learn Conservation Webinar Series. I am Allie Lewis, coordinator for the partnership, and we're really excited to welcome today Eric Roy from the Gund Institute for Environmental Studies. He is a fellow and a professor with the Rubenstein School of Natural Resources, focused on ecological design and nutrient cycling. So as a reminder about the partnership, briefly, let's see, sorry, I want you to see this full screen. The Vermont Ag Water Quality Partnership, our collective purpose is to improve ag water quality in Vermont by coordinating partner efforts so we can provide education, technical, and financial assistance to the ag community. And we have three main overarching goals of our strategic plan. The first is to improve water quality and wildlife habitat on all the farmland engaged in programs, to deliver technical and financial assistance in a way that's efficient and effective, and in doing so, to provide the best service experience possible for those participating in our programs. And that's it for our intro slides. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here sharing about your work, about ecological services and wetlands. I know this is a topic that has been requested. People want to hear about it. So thank you for joining us today. And for folks, if you have questions, if you could hold them to the end or put them in the chat, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thanks so much, Allie. Pleasure to be with you all and share some of our recent research. I will say that in terms of the ecosystem services that wetlands provide, I'll be pretty narrowly focused on nutrient retention in this talk, but my work in that area is currently being linked to a broader effort called the Functioning Floodplains Initiative in Vermont, where folks are thinking a lot about things like, protection from flooding, as well as habitat for species of concern. So, water quality is one piece of that, and that's the piece I'll be focusing on today. And so I'm not sure if anybody was on the LCBP TAC call a couple weeks ago. I gave a final report for this project. If you were on that call, this is going to be pretty similar. So just let you know that up front. Actually, very, very similar. So hold on, I have someone calling me on Teams. Okay, so I'm going to focus on quantifying phosphorus retention in restored riparian wetlands of the Lake Champlain Basin. This is work that I led with a PhD student, Adrian Wiegman, and then Breck Bowden and Kristen Underwood were also project members. And so this was funded by the Lake Champlain Basin program. And so, our approach to better understanding what wetlands provide in terms of water quality improvement in floodplain corridors is to combine field monitoring, laboratory studies, and modeling to study riparian wetland phosphorus retention. And this kind of multifaceted approach is important for a variety of reasons. One, we need to get out there on the ground and try to measure what we can as a proof of concept, and not solely rely on models. There's some kind of rule of thumb estimates for how much phosphorus wetlands can retain that are out there. Those have been applied in some larger scale modeling efforts in Vermont in the past, and we really don't have a great handle on how well those assumptions hold up under scrutiny from field and lab work. And the lab work can help us dial in more our understanding about certain processes that are going on out in these wetlands that are influencing how phosphorus cycles in these systems. And then modeling is ultimately required to put the pieces together to try to understand how the different processes that we've measured in the field or in the lab, when they're all happening at the same time, what is the final result in terms of how much phosphorus can these wetland systems retain? And so we have to consider things like the landscape positioning, as well as the land use history, the hydrology of these sites, as well as the vegetation. And a key focus in our work are wetland soils. Wetland soils are critical in terms of phosphorus cycling. It's where the bulk of the phosphorus in a riparian wetland exists. It's within the soil compartment. So understanding the inputs of phosphorus to the soil, as well as the potential release for phosphorus from the soil, and what factors within the soil control that release. And our work was motivated by just this fact about wetland restoration candidate sites in Vermont. If we look at this map in pink here showing all the potential restoration candidate sites. This is from the work put out by Airwood Environmental and Fitzgerald Environmental in 2017. Many of these sites, most of these sites overlie agricultural soils that were likely at one point drained through water management using ditches or other mechanisms to make them more suitable for cultivation. So we have this landscape that has this agricultural legacy, and there are increasingly activities going on where we're restoring some of this former agricultural land back to wetland. And so that creates some questions about how these systems will function. I know folks are looking at these systems in terms of how long does it take them to develop, biological characteristics that are more representative of wetlands that are not restored, more natural wetlands. And in our work, we're really particularly interested in how the soil develops over time and how that could affect whether or not these systems work well for retaining phosphorus. And so when it comes to phosphorus retention within a wetland system, it comes down to a question of mass balance. Obviously, we have our phosphorus coming into the wetland during an inundation event where there's flooding, and then phosphorus that could potentially leave the wetland. And so ultimately, there's some phosphorus retained and some phosphorus released potentially. And when we did a literature review about this years ago, it became very clear that there's two primary mechanisms at play for wetlands restored on former agricultural land. The first is the one that is most familiar to folks and that most people have focused on when trying to understand how much phosphorus wetlands can capture, and that is the retention of particles. So as floodwaters move in, particles can settle out over wetlands as the water slows down. Those particles have attached phosphorus, either attached to mineral particles or potentially part of organic particles that move into the system. So that's the key mechanism by which phosphorus is captured. But another thing that's very apparent in the literature is that soils, and especially those with a history of agricultural use, have the potential to release phosphorus in dissolved forms or soluble reactive phosphorus during inundation events. So when we have a soil that has phosphorus in it and it's flooded for a period of time, it can often go anaerobic, meaning there are low oxygen conditions, and that can facilitate the release of some of the phosphorus held in the soil. And so there's been a little bit of research on this, trying to put these two things together. We know that these wetlands capture particles. We know that they probably leak a little bit of dissolved pee, but not many people have been able to improve our understanding of how these two things balance out and what is that net phosphorus retention we get at the end. And so as part of this effort, we've done some projects looking at a larger number of sites, but we also did this LCBP project, really focused in intensively on 3 wetland sites in the Lake Champlain Basin. One is on a tributary to Lewis Creek called Prindle Brook. So that site's labeled here as Prindle Road. On that land, agricultural activity ceased approximately in 2006. We also had 2 sites along the Otter Creek. one off Swamp Road, and one off of Union Street. And I should mention that Prindle Road and Swamp Road are currently managed by the Nature Conservancy, and the Union Street site is an NRCS conservation easement. And so for the two Otter Creek sites, for Swamp Road, agricultural activity ceased over 10 years ago. And for Union Street, agricultural activity ceased around 2004. And so we had multiple sampling sites out here where we were working to not only understand the nature of the soils at these sites, but to actually monitor flood inundation events at these sites to track the phosphorus in the water column during flooding events and use that information to help us understand how much phosphorus is being retained. And so my colleague, Rebecca Deal, who I'm collaborating with closely now in ongoing efforts, she's done some work looking at floodplains more broadly, not necessarily just wetland systems, and trying to understand the deposition of phosphorus in floodplains, how much phosphorus is retained in well-connected floodplains. And so she's put together some information that's published as a LCBP report that characterizes both medium and low energy floodplain sites. I just want to highlight here on this graph the three sites I'll be focused on mostly for this talk: Prindle Road, Union Street, and Swamp Road. These are low energy sites, which is typical of a lot of the herbaceous riparian wetland systems we see. I mean, that's the nature of these systems, is the low water or low energy, often stay inundated for periods of time. And so, you know, these systems will behave a little differently in terms of phosphorus dynamics than medium energy systems or systems that are more infrequently flooded, that take a larger event to become wet. So our systems flood, you know, at least once or twice a year in this study. So they're systems that are pretty wet pretty often. And so the key questions that we were trying to answer with our field and lab work in this study is, what is the magnitude of particulate phosphorus deposition in these wetlands? And do we see evidence in the field of potential export of soluble reactive phosphorus from the study wetlands? What factors influence particulate phosphorus deposition and internal soluble reactive phosphorus release? And what combination of methods are most useful for estimating particulate phosphorus deposition and internal SRP release? These things are difficult to measure. So, you know, we tried multiple ways and settled upon some that work better than others. And so I'll just get right to the data we collected and how it helps us answer these questions. So is there evidence of particulate phosphorus deposition in the study wetlands? The answer is yes. And so how exactly do we quantify that? One thing that's challenging in these wetland environments is, you know, with the dense wetland vegetation, it can be difficult to separate material that came from the flood versus material that was generated within the wetland itself. So, for example, when you have floodwaters moving through these systems carrying fine particles, sometimes those fine particles will settle to the soil surface. Sometimes they actually remain attached to the vegetation. And those of you who have visited these systems have seen that kind of dusty appearance that the vegetation can have after it's been inundated during an event. So how do we isolate that new material that's come in and determine how much phosphorus it contains? Well, we tried a few different ways. One of the ways that worked fairly well is to try to separate out the plant litter, the macrophyte litter. So we looked at the total accretion of phosphorus over tiles that are 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. And so that total accretion includes everything. It includes everything that came from the river, the vegetation after it senesces, and any other internal processes that would, you know, put matter on top of our tiles. And then we also determined the amount of phosphorus that we would expect to be contained within the plant litter itself. So we could subtract that and come up with an estimate of how much phosphorus was in the sediment and potentially any other detritus that was added to the system. And that's what you see on the right graph there. And so on all three of these graphs, we have the 90th percentile flooding depth. So the greater that number is on the x-axis, the wetter that particular plot. And so as you can see, the plots that were inundated more frequently and for longer duration is where we quantified the most new phosphorus. So anywhere from 0 new phosphorus to up to approximately 1 gram of phosphorus per meter squared of sediment and detritus. And another way we looked at this is to, again, look at the total amount of phosphorus that's accreting at a given location, and then to separate that into inorganic and organic forms. So the organic form should include the plant litter, as well as any other organic material like algae that might be deposited, or any other organisms within the site that might have died and be on top of our tiles. So we can separate that out and get an inorganic and an organic fraction of the new phosphorus. And we've actually decided that this inorganic fraction is probably our best estimate of the new phosphorus that's come in. Similar to the last slide I showed, the range in inorganic phosphorus that we're seeing on top of our tiles ranges from not much at all to about 1 gram of phosphorus per meter squared. And this was across an annual cycle. So the units really are grams phosphorus per meter squared per year here. Again, we see the most phosphorus in the areas that have lower elevation and are more frequently inundated. So we also did the water sampling approach to try to understand, what's going on in the water column as these systems flood and drain. And so we had all sorts of things going on as part of this. We're monitoring water level, monitoring dissolved oxygen within the water column, as well as temperature at the median elevation plot for each site. We also had ISCO auto samplers that would be triggered upon inundation and that we could use at various points throughout the flood event to take more samples and understand changes over shorter time spans. We also employed what are called passive siphon samplers. So we adapted a design by the USGS, and these were neat because we could place bottles in various points throughout our systems, and they would be triggered automatically once the water level reached a certain height. And that allowed us to make sure we got samples at important moments when floodwaters were entering the system, even if we couldn't be there in person, and then we could collect those within 24 hours. And then we did a bunch of grab sampling in concert with these other efforts. And so for all three of the sites I'm focused on today, we monitored 3 flood pulses across those sites and monitored the water quality during those flood pulses. And so when we look at the water, again, getting to this question, is there evidence of particulate phosphorus deposition in the study wetlands? The answer here is it kind of depends. So in general, yes, but it depends on the system. So Prindle Road is more of a headwater system, has relatively low concentrations of TSS in the influent water. So we're already starting without a lot of solids entering this system. And so we didn't really necessarily pick up a clear signal that TSS was being reduced in the wetland. And in the outflow, we actually see some elevated concentrations at times, and that's largely because this system, the outflow is regulated by a beaver dam. And that beaver dam was eroding to some degree during the study period. So we were seeing some higher TSS concentrations on the other side of that beaver dam at times. For the Otter Creek sites, however, the signal is very clear that the water moving into these systems has relatively high TSS, up to about 100 milligram per liter during the filling period. And then within the wetland, we consistently see lower concentrations of solids, suggesting that as the river water moves into these systems, the solids are settling out pretty quickly. And that's especially true at Union Street, the more upstream site, also true at Swamp Road, although the influent concentrations are a little lower there. But the trends were still significant when looking at the filling river water versus the wetland water. Now, if we look at total phosphorus, so that was total suspended solids, it's a fairly similar story for Prindle Road. Not a lot of clear trends across the inflow, the wetland, and the outflow. But for the Union Street and Swamp Road systems, this is where we start to maybe see some evidence of some internal phosphorus release too, where we didn't necessarily see super clear trends at Union Street in the total phosphorus concentration. Keep in mind, this is concentration. We're not talking mass balance yet. We're just looking at concentrations. So the river and the wetland had pretty similar concentrations of phosphorus during the filling stage, as well as the draining stage at Union Street. And at Swamp Road, the river and the wetland, actually the wetland concentrations of phosphorus were higher within the wetland during the filling stage than the river. No trend on the draining phase. So here we're seeing, all right, there's clear in the Otter Creek sites, there's clear loss of TSS, but we're not necessarily seeing as clear of a loss of total phosphorus as we would predict from TSS. And so we've looked at this in more detail, and this is our water level data. So the blue lines on this graph show the flood pulse. I'm just focusing in on a couple of flood pulses here that show some interesting dynamics. So the blue lines show the flood pulse coming in. The red line is the oxygen level in the water column. And then the black line is the temperature. So at Union Street, I'm showing you a winter pulse as well as a spring pulse. And if you're wondering, the winter pulse, yes, it was very challenging to monitor a winter pulse out there, but we got it done. And I'm glad we did, because we saw some different dynamics between winter and spring. So one thing we noticed in using our ISCO data, so this is the high frequency data we were able to capture during these inundation events, is that like our grab sampling data that I showed you in previous slides and passive siphon data, we always saw relatively low TSS in the system. But TP showed some interesting dynamics where often at the beginning of floods, like as the blue line starts to increase in these graphs, we see relatively high concentrations of phosphorus. At the peak of the inundation event, so at the peak of the blue curve, if you look at the total phosphorus graphs underneath, that's when we actually see lower phosphorus concentrations. So the river is essentially diluting some of the phosphorus that was existing in the wetland water to begin with. And then over time, what's interesting is in the winter, we see phosphorus concentrations come up again and go relatively high. In the spring, the phosphorus concentrations do start increasing again, but never really get greater than the river concentrations. And I should mention that those dotted lines with the shaded areas, that's the river concentrations. So when we're above that, obviously there's some evidence of a source of phosphorus in the wetland. And when we're in that or below that, the water is very similar to whatever's in the river. So that was interesting, and that will lead to the next piece. But so is there evidence of particulate phosphorus deposition in the study wetlands? Yes. The TSS results indicate sediment deposition on the floodplain. It is challenging to isolate the new phosphorus deposition in these low energy wetland systems for quantification. There's multiple ways to do it. We think our estimate of inorganic phosphorus accretion is the way to go. It's relatively straightforward compared to other methods. and it helps us isolate the new phosphorus versus that's part of the plant litter and other materials within the system. And so the inorganic P accretion range from 0.1 to 1 grams phosphorus per meter squared per year. This is on the lower end of the spectrum for floodplain phosphorus deposition within the basin as estimated by Rebecca Deal and colleagues. But this makes sense given the lower energy settings where we're working. Rebecca has actually found greater deposition rates in higher energy settings where you're moving more sediment. But in those higher energy settings, it's also potential, you can also have the potential for some erosion too. So these lower energy wetlands sites aren't necessarily going to capture as much phosphorus for any given event, but they make up a large area. And the phosphorus that is captured, at least the particles that are captured, are less likely to erode down the road. But the water column total phosphorus concentrations in wetlands during draining phase was often near or below those of the river source, but not always. So we are starting to see some indication that this internal source of P may be important, depending on site and season. And so this is where the lab work comes in to better understand, all right, well, what's the potential for these soils in these systems to release phosphorus into the water column? So we've done across 14 different sites and 20 plots in total, we've done intact core incubations to essentially simulate flooding events over soils in the lab to better understand their what happens with dissolved phosphorus during these times. And so this work was part of the LCBP project. So we did this at our 3 LCBP sites, but we also had some funding from GUND and Vermont DEC through the Functioning Floodplains Initiative to do some additional sites as well. And so what we do in these sites is we take an intact core in the field, for this method, we take an intact core in the field, we bring it back into the lab, we carefully drain off the site water from the core, and then we use filtered river water to simulate flooding events under 2 conditions. One, which I'll refer to as aerobic or O2, where we periodically pulse the system with room air to keep a more aerobic water column where oxygen is present, and another where we instead pulse the cores with nitrogen gas to keep a more anaerobic environment. And those are labeled in some future graphs as N2. And so the N2 are the gray bars here. These are the anaerobic conditions. And then the red bars are the more aerobic conditions, or O2. And these are all 20 plots. So these come from a variety of sites across Vermont. I've labeled on the bottom here the ones that are associated with our Lake Champlain Basin Program project. And so you can see our Union Street site falls at the low end of phosphorus release. What's shown here is that we run these incubations. It's approximately a 2-week process. And the way I've plotted this here is this is the final concentration of soluble reactive phosphorus in the water column above the soil at the end of the simulated flood. And so the higher the final SRP concentration on the y-axis, the more potential for that soil to release dissolved phosphorus to the water column. So Union Street is at the low end of that potential. Swamp Road and Prindle Road are kind of in the middle. Some of the sites on the far right here are actually active farm fields where, that have been more recently recipients of fertilizer or manure, more likely manure. And so those are the sites that we see the greatest potential for this dissolved P loss. And if we look at our field data, that it makes sense that that's in the lab, but is this happening in the field? One way to think about this is to look at the relationship between total phosphorus and total suspended solids. Just focus in on B here, Union Street. The triangles are this nice linear relationship we see in the river between total suspended solids and total phosphorus. And so if, all that was going on in these wetlands is we're just capturing solids and that's removing phosphorus and nothing else is at play, we wouldn't expect to see much deviation from that red line. But when we look at the black dots, these are from our water samples within the wetland. We see that there are many times when we have low total suspended solids concentration. So we've essentially removed solids from the water column, and we still see higher total phosphorus. And that's especially true at Swamp Road. These trends are nowhere near as clear for the more headwater system of Prindle Road, where we don't see clear trends between the influent and wetland system or the effluent. So these kind of black dots going up vertically around zero suggest, yes, there's this dissolved phosphorus thing that we see in the lab is likely happening in the field as well. A little bit more evidence of that relates to the dissolved oxygen. So again, just focus on Union Street here, the one in the middle. Triangles are river samples. They're circled by the thicker red line, and then the dotted red line on the outside circles much of the data for the wetland, which are again the black dots. And so what we see happening in the wetland is lower oxygen concentrations in the water, which makes sense. That tends to happen in wetlands because there's a lot of breakdown of organic material that consumes oxygen. And it's at those lower oxygen concentrations that we tend to see the higher concentrations of SRP. So this is what we would expect based on first principles, that when you have a system that goes more anaerobic, that can induce the release of phosphorus that's associated with iron, and that could lead to higher concentrations of dissolved phosphorus in the water column. So we see that at Union Street and Swamp Road. We don't see that as much at Prindle Road. And then again, coming back to these high frequency data, that it's, I showed you the total phosphorus dynamics before that kind of had the inverse relationship to the water level, the blue line. They're kind of in a mirror. Again, we see that same mirroring effect where the SRP is kind of the reverse of the water level. It's actually lowest when the river water is at inundation is at its highest. And it's high before the river water comes in, and it starts to increase on the falling limb of the flood events again. So this kind of upside down, or actually right side up U shape or V shape. That was very apparent in winter, but we see it less in spring. And we think what might be going on here is, well, in spring, we have a lot of other things growing out in these wetlands, like attached periphyton that are growing on the wetland plants, floating algae. They might be limiting how much of this SRP can be released into the water column. And it also makes sense that we see higher SRP concentrations in the winter because the oxygen levels shown in red here are lower during the winter than they are in the spring. So under those lower oxygen conditions, we would expect to see the higher dissolved phosphorus. So is there evidence of internal SRP release in the study wetlands? The simulated floods using intact soil cores in the lab suggested that each site was capable of releasing at least some soluble reactive phosphorus. Floodwater samples collected in the field showed evidence of SRP release at Otter Creek, not as much at Prindle Road, and the patterns in correlated dissolved oxygen and SRP concentrations suggest that biology is mediating the phosphorus cycling and determining whether or not we're seeing more SRP release at certain times. All right, so I'm gonna kind of quickly get through the modeling, kind of putting this all together. So we've looked at the two sides of the coin, the capturing particles side and the potential for dissolved P release side. Our field measurements don't allow us to easily estimate the relative impact of those two processes. We can kind of see that they're happening, we can measure them to some degree, but we really need a model to put this all together. So our modeling question is, what is the mass balance and retention efficiency for total phosphorus, and then to look just at the dissolved fraction for the 3 wetlands studied. And how might this change if there's changes in hydrology due to climate or land use? And how might phosphorus balances in restored riparian wetlands be affected by changes in upstream water quality? And so we built a model in R that simulates the key phosphorus cycling processes in these wetland systems. So this includes plants, roots and shoots, plant litter, the decay of that litter, and both organic and inorganic forms of phosphorus cycling within these systems. And so this allows us to kind of run a simulation informed heavily by our field data. We measured most of these pools in the field at our field sites. So that gives us confidence that we've calibrated this model in a way that reproduces what we see in the field. And we can use this model to help us tease apart the different impacts of new phosphorus settling in these systems versus some dissolved P potentially being released. And so why did we build a new model? There are some existing models out there. Many of those are either too simple for our intended use. For example, a lot of wetland water quality models assume wetlands capture a fixed percentage of incoming phosphorus loads. We wanted to have more information than that. Or there's also models out there that are even as complex as that model I just showed you. Look, there's some that are more complex and you could only really easily run the model for one particular location. So we're trying to strike that balance of something that's usable across multiple locations, represents the key aspects of the complexity of the system, but doesn't kind of go overboard so that it makes it really difficult to use in the future. And there's also this disconnect between field researchers and modelers, where some of the most widely collected and available soil metrics that inform the legacy phosphorus assessment or the assessment of soil's ability to store and hold on to phosphorus are not necessarily directly transferable to the existing models. So our model can use a limited number of inputs, primarily 2 soil parameters comprising soil phosphorus storage capacity, the influent water quality, and then some hydroclimate data on, how much will this system be inundated. And then it can also simulate how the soils will change over time, and it will be open source and coded in R. And I'm going to skip over this. I can get to some of this if there's questions, but I just want to take you to the key point. So, we run this model. We've basically done this huge sensitivity analysis where we're testing various assumptions about sediment trapping, various assumptions about influent water quality. And these are the results we see, these kind of spread of results using these box plots in the total phosphorus retention efficiency. And so again, these model runs are taking place after we've made sure that the model's generally reproducing what we observe directly in the field for certain things like how much biomass is produced, how much phosphorus deposition did we measure, those types of things. So after that, then we put it through more of a sensitivity analysis to understand how changes in inundation amount might matter, how changes in incoming concentrations might matter, and how assumptions about sediment trapping might matter. And you can see the total phosphorus retention values are generally above 0. They're generally positive, which is good. That means that these systems are net phosphorus sinks, that they're capturing more phosphorus than they're releasing. But you see it can vary a bit depending on some assumptions about sediment trapping, as well as between sites. Some sites look like safer bets for high phosphorus retention efficiency than others. But in general, if we drew an average across here, we're seeing an average of around 40% total phosphorus retention efficiency, which is actually kind of funny because that is the number some have used to assume that all wetlands capture approximately 40%. So I think what we found says, yeah, if you're going to use one number, that's not a bad number to use. But when we dial in on a site-by-site basis, we're going to see some variability. And we did see some scenarios where we saw net phosphorus loss, although those were less prominent. Now, that's a really good part of the story. And I think that last graph gives us good confidence that restoring wetlands in these areas will help meet longer term goals in terms of reducing overall phosphorus loading to the lake. Here's the snag though, the dissolved phosphorus retention efficiency. So this compares the dissolved phosphorus coming into the system versus going out. These mass balance results did not look so promising. They show that on average, these systems are releasing more dissolved phosphorus than is flowing into them. And so that gives that, even though we've reduced total phosphorus, so there's less total phosphorus moving downstream, a greater proportion of that phosphorus that does move downstream will be in dissolved form. Which dissolved form is not good because it can be obviously more readily available for phytoplankton in receiving lakes. So this is something we need to think about more and think about designs that can help reduce this loss of dissolved P. So even though the general take-home message is good, that wetlands do capture phosphorus, and it seems like some of the assumptions we've been working under, despite not having much measurement to back them up, weren't that bad. And 40% phosphorus retention is a decent estimate for these systems, but we are seeing some leakage of dissolved P that is of concern. And one thing I should note here is there's a stream concentration factor on the bottom, 0.5, 1, and 2. So 1 is the concentrations that we measured. 0.5 is half of the concentrations of phosphorus. 2 is twice the concentration of phosphorus. You can see that this problem actually is most prevalent when the stream phosphorus concentration or the river phosphorus concentration is lower. So if we're in a situation where we do improve water quality upstream and have lower phosphorus coming in, these systems could be more prone to release some of that dissolved P. And just to summarize and compare to the literature, so this is a graph from a review paper by Land et al. In 2016, and I've modified it here to include our study results as the gray bar. But if you look at created free water or created wetlands for treating farm runoff, the literature says 40 to 50% is a decent estimate for the amount of phosphorus they'll capture. But the existing literature to date had not been so favorable for restored drain croplands, showing on average across the studies net loss. But our study is more in line, that we see this pretty wide error bars here, but the median result is again right around that 40% mark. And we think one reason that our results might differ from the literature is our sites were all approximately 10 years old in terms of being wetlands again and not agricultural fields. We have a lot of reason to believe in the work we've been doing that these systems will get better at retaining phosphorus over time. Some of the literature studies have taken place immediately post-restoration, and that might be a period where we see less favorable results. And so just from our model, the net phosphorus retention estimates we see ranged from negative 0.04 to 0.24 grams phosphorus per meter squared per year. This is about 0.4 to 2 pounds phosphorus per acre. Most of our simulations pointed to a number for these systems of around a pound of phosphorus captured per acre per year. And I think that's all I have. Yeah, the last thing is just that, if these systems become flooded more due to changes in climate, or there are changes in upstream water quality, those things can affect net P retention. So it's not going to be a fixed number. It will change depending on those circumstances. And the effects of changing upstream water quality seem particularly important to consider. You're going to retain more phosphorus in areas where the river has higher phosphorus concentrations. When we get to rivers that have low phosphorus concentrations, these systems will be less efficient. Just highlight, we have additional efforts underway related to this, the Vermont Functioning Floodplains Initiative. I'm working with others to take our results from this focus study and look at a larger number of sites and characteristics of those sites to create a geospatial framework for estimating the phosphorus retention possible. We also have funding from USDA NRCS to do deeper dives on 6 sites, including one of the sites I shared with you today, for 3 years, to continue monitoring them in the field and to do some additional lab work to build the strength of our confidence in our model, so that we can continue to make that model as good as it can be to help us produce estimates for different sites in terms of how much phosphorus they can capture. So lots of folks helped out with this. Maybe some of you are on the call, but it's been a effort over really the last 4 or 5 years leading up to this point. Adrian Wiegman, just point out, is an absolute warrior in the field and really worked under some tough conditions out there to get that data that I showed you today. So undergrads helped with this a lot, over a dozen of them actually. And yeah, just thanking the DEC Wetlands Program, NRCS, Nature Conservancy, GUND, and the Lake Champlain Basin Program for funding. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Eric. That was really interesting. It was nice to get a deep dive into the science there and the work that's been going on. So folks, we'll just open it up. If you want to put your question in the chat, that's fine. Also, feel free to unmute and ask your question. Well, I did have somebody reach out to me who wasn't able to come to this, but's going to listen to the recording, who had a question about, and it's great to see Laura's here from DEC Wetlands, question about, and you kind of talked about this, but where are we at with like what information do we need to know to be able to make decisions about should we maybe be conserving more wetlands or classifying wetlands as maybe class 1, or kind of making those decisions. It sounds like there's more research to be done, but if there was a glass ball, maybe, what do you think the next 10 years might look like?
Well, I mean, Laura can speak to some of the classification systems better than I can, but I would say where we're trying to get is to a point where we can take relatively little information. So if we know something about the soils, something about the past land use and the position on the landscape, we can use that to come up with a system that will help us rank certain sites over others in terms of their potential to improve water quality. So, a lot of, we're kind of gotten in the weeds in my talk a lot, but we're trying, it's all as part of an effort to get to a simpler place where we can say, all right, if I have these 3 pieces of information, I can come up with a defensible estimate for how much phosphorus that could be retained on that parcel of land over a given time frame. And I think we've made a lot of progress in that direction and are getting pretty close to being able to do that. And again, this is just from the phosphorus perspective though. I mean, I'm in favor of restoring wetlands for a variety of reasons, but if we're making decisions based on which site will capture more phosphorus, we want to provide tools that can help people be informed when they make that decision.
Thanks. Hillary, did you have a question?
I do have a question. We were looking at mapping the watersheds of wetlands. Sorry, my microphone's not very good. We were looking at mapping the watersheds of wetlands that are draining, that are then in a watershed that drains to a lake. Mm-hmm. And I wondered, there's been some local issues with wetlands receiving a lot of road runoff and then flooding during storms. And I'm wondering, at some point, do they become inundated and lose their ability to sort of retain this, maybe some amounts that we'd assume they might otherwise be able to retain? Yeah,
I mean, so let me take you to an extreme example, wetlands that are used to treat wastewater. So if you are in that type of situation with a really high phosphorus loading rate, eventually you will saturate the wetland's ability to hang on to phosphorus. We don't tend to see that as much on the landscape because the loads that these wetlands are receiving are much lower than that kind of wastewater situation. So they tend to have greater longevity at being able to hang on to the phosphorus. When we look at our data set, all of the evidence so far suggests they will get, these types of systems I mentioned today will get better over time. They're building organic soil. The phosphorus that is in the soil is in forms that is less likely to leak out over time. And there's just the fact that you've lost some of the phosphorus that's most easily lost, right? Like if you convert from a farm field to a wetland, some of that easy to lose phosphorus will be lost very quickly. In year 10, it's already gone, so we don't need to worry about it anymore. So I would say on the landscape, most of the time I'm seeing the opposite, that we would expect them to retain phosphorus better as they age. But there could be some situations where there's really high loading rates, like certain stormwater systems or wastewater systems where you see the opposite, that they tend to get worse over time.
All right, well, folks, I think we'll type Eric's contact information into the chat if you have other questions you want to ask him. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am asking if you could just take, it takes like 1 minute to complete our survey. We really do use that feedback. And thank you again, Eric, for this information. It was great to hear this presentation. I'll be sending out the recording for our partnership. We do have a lot of folks that listen in. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, and yeah, folks, feel free to reach out to me later with any questions or ideas. Appreciate it.